The church in Copper Ridge felt colder than the October wind outside. Its wooden beams held the smell of dust, old hymn books, and a judgment that clung to the air like smoke from a dying fire. People filled every pew, ranch wives with stiff collars, miners smelling faintly of coal, widows wrapped in shawls, and all of them sat in a silence so heavy it seemed carved out of stone. At the front of the room stood Eleanor Wade, a 19-year-old woman who carried the blood of the Apache in her bones and the quiet strength of her people in the set of her jaw. Today, though, she felt anything but strong. She stood in a borrowed white dress that hung off her shoulders like it belonged to someone else. Its lace yellowed, its bodice too loose. Beneath the worn fabric, hidden close to her skin, she had tucked the beaded bracelet her mother once made. Small pieces of red and turquoise that whispered of a life that now felt impossibly far away. The congregation watched her with the same expression they might give a stranger wandering into town at dusk. Part curiosity, part suspicion. To them, she wasn't just a young bride without a say. She was a reminder of something wild and foreign that had no place in Copper Ridge. Some tilted their heads to get a better look. Others didn't bother hiding their frowns. Their eyes crawled over her like a cold wind. Her father wasn't there. His absence settled over her shoulders heavier than the dress. Shame kept him away, or maybe guilt. The last month had broken him. The drought, the failed harvest, the notice from the bank nailed to their door like a death sentence. And finally, the bargain. The marriage contract that promised to erase his debts if he agreed to give away his daughter. He had cried, but he had still signed. Now Eleanor stood beside Clayton Hartwell, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, a man whose reputation rode ahead of him like dust behind a galloping horse. Clayton was 34, tall, broad-shouldered, with a stoic calm carved deep into his face. His hat was clutched in his hands and he stared straight ahead, unmoving. He looked less like a groom and more like a figure carved from granite, solid, silent, and unreadable. Eleanor didn't dare look at him for long. She already felt swallowed by the room, by the watchers, by the fate she had not chosen. Her palms grew damp around the wilted bouquet of prairie roses, and she counted the floorboards between her and the door, wondering, just for a moment, if running would be possible. It wasn't. The aisle seemed miles long, and every eye in Copper Ridge would follow her like a pack of hungry coyotes. The minister opened his book, his voice echoing off the wooden rafters. "Dearly beloved." His words drifted around Eleanor, distant and hollow. She heard them, but they didn't settle. Her mind spun like a leaf in winter wind. When the question finally came, "Do you, Eleanor Wade, take this man?" Her throat tightened. All she could hear was her heartbeat and the soft rattle of beads under her dress, like her mother's voice urging her to stay strong. Her answer, when it slipped out, was barely more than a tremor. "I do." The room leaned forward, as if feeding on her surrender. Then came Clayton's turn. "Do you, Clayton James Hartwell?" His reply cut through the church like a clean blade. "I will." Not "I do," not the expected vow. A murmur rippled through the pews. Women exchanged glances, men frowned, and someone in the back whispered too loudly. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked up at the man beside her, startled by the certainty in his voice. His jaw was tense, his gaze fixed forward. Yet for a fleeting second, she sensed he wasn't cold, just contained. The minister closed the book. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words felt final, like the clank of a cell door or the snap of a trap. Clayton turned slightly, offering his arm. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over his sleeve. It took 4 heartbeats, slow, painful, to lift her trembling fingers and place them in his. His grip was steady, not tight, not possessive, just steady. They walked down the aisle together as the silence finally broke. Whispers chased them, sharp as cactus thorns. Outside, the cold air struck Eleanor's face, and she drew in a breath as if surfacing from deep water. The town watched from the steps, from behind windows, from every corner of the dusty street. She stepped into the sunlight feeling like a shadow of herself, someone drifting farther and farther away from the life she once knew. As the church doors closed behind her, she realized with a heavy ache, her future no longer belonged to her. It hadn't the moment she walked inside. The road leading out of Copper Ridge curled along the foothills like a long, lonely scar. As the wagon creaked forward, the wind swept down from the mountains and cut across Eleanor's cheeks, sharp as a warning. It carried the smell of pine, dust, and the far-off smoke of evening fires, scents that belonged to the land where she was born. Each gust felt like a hand reaching for her, urging her to turn back, to cling to the last traces of her Apache home. But the wagon didn't slow, and Clayton Hartwell didn't look back. He sat beside her on the hard wooden seat, reins in his hands, his posture straight and unreadable. He didn't crowd her or speak unnecessarily. When he did talk, his words were short, like he was afraid of saying too much, or perhaps afraid of the silence that came after. "Road's rough this way," he said once. Another time, "Cold's coming early this year." Nothing more, nothing that reached her. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers brushing the hidden bracelet beneath her sleeve. The beads were warm against her skin, grounding her, reminding her she still belonged to someone, even if it was only to her mother's memory. The sun dipped lower, coloring the sky in streaks of fire. Ahead of them rose the Hartwell Ranch, its sprawling fields turning gold under the fading light. The house came into view shortly after, larger than anything Eleanor had ever imagined. A two-story structure with a wraparound porch, solid timber walls, and windows glowing with lamplight. It was the kind of place people in town whispered about. A house built by wealth, by legacy, by a man who had everything except the things she'd just been forced to give, herself. To Eleanor, it felt like a trap made of cedar and good intentions. Clayton pulled the wagon to a stop. "We're here." She swallowed, her throat stiff. When her boots hit the ground, the earth beneath her felt unfamiliar, too firm, too foreign. The house loomed above her, its silhouette cutting deep into the twilight. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was simply not hers, like a nest built for another bird entirely. Clayton unloaded her small bundle of belongings without a word. Then he gestured toward the front steps. "Let me show you around." Inside, the house was warm, warmer than she expected. The sense of pine wood, tobacco, and something like stew hung in the air. A fire snapped in the stone hearth, filling the wide living room with shifting shadows. Eleanor's eyes drifted across the shelves lined with old books, the polished dining table, the sturdy rugs woven in deep reds and browns. Everything looked too heavy, too permanent, too rooted. She felt like a gust of wind passing through a place built to withstand hurricanes. Clayton walked ahead, speaking quietly as he pointed out each room. The kitchen, the sitting room, the pantry stocked with more food than her family had owned in a year. His voice stayed calm and even, but never warm. She sensed he wasn't avoiding her. This was simply who he was. A man who had learned to bury his emotions deep, the way the desert buries bones. At the top of the staircase, he paused before the last door on the right. "This one's yours." Eleanor stepped inside the room. It was small but tidy, with a clean quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed and a single oil lamp on the nightstand. A pitcher of water waited by the wash basin. Someone, Clayton, she guessed, had taken great care to prepare it, but she didn't understand why. Clayton followed her to the doorway and stopped there. He tapped the metal latch gently, not crossing the threshold. "There's a lock on the inside," he said. "Use it if you want. I won't come in unless you ask." The words landed with the weight of a boulder. Eleanor's breath hitched, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to relief. In her whole life, no man had ever offered her a boundary he didn't intend to cross. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. Clayton dipped his head once, a simple acknowledgement, and stepped back. "Good night, Eleanor." When the door clicked shut, she stood alone in the stillness of the room. She touched the lock with trembling fingers, then turned it. The faint metallic snap echoed louder than any church bell. She sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, eyes fixed on the dark window. Outside, the night stretched endlessly over the plains. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its cry long and lonely, a sound she knew well. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She lay awake until dawn, listening to the creak of old wood and the whisper of distant wolves. sounds that reminded her she was no longer home. But they were the only familiar things left. The first days inside the Hartwell house slipped by like slow-moving shadows, quiet, shapeless, easy to lose track of. Eleanor moved through the rooms the way a ghost might drift through a place that did not belong to her. She kept her footsteps light, her breath shallow, her presence as small as she could make it. The house wasn't hostile, but it wasn't home either. It was simply large, too full of silence that didn't answer her back. In the mornings, the smell of coffee reached her door long before she dared open it. She always waited, listening for Clayton's boots crossing the floor, for the back door closing behind him, for the scrape of a chair pushed away from the table. Only when the house settled again into that deep, heavy stillness would she slip out of her room. She ate quickly at the kitchen table, head down, hands steady. She washed her cup and placed it back exactly where she found it. Then she returned to her room, the way a deer returns to the place it last felt safe. Clayton never said anything about her routine, and she never asked if he noticed. Every evening, around the same hour, just as the sky was turning the color of embers, Eleanor heard a faint sound outside her door. Not a knock, not footsteps stopping to speak, just the soft clink of ceramic against wood. When she opened the door, she always found a plate. Sometimes it held stew, thick and warm, sometimes cornbread, sometimes just beans and a piece of salted meat. Always enough to fill her, but never enough to suggest pity. He didn't wait for her to thank him. He didn't ask if she liked it. He simply left the food and walked away. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She had grown up in a world where kindness always came with conditions, especially from men with power. Yet Clayton expected nothing. He made no demands, didn't ask where she spent her hours, never one step too close. He barely spoke except for a quiet, "Good morning" if she happened to pass him in the hall and couldn't avoid his gaze fast enough. A white man with land, money, and influence had no reason to behave this way toward a half Apache woman. She couldn't understand him, and not understanding him frightened her more than the marriage itself. Still, some part of her, a small, tender part that had not yet been smothered by fear, noticed the things he did not say, the lines he did not cross. It was on the fourth morning that something shifted. Eleanor woke before dawn, as she always did, but instead of sitting in the dark waiting for the house to empty, she walked straight to the door. Her fingers hovered over the lock. It had become her shield, her last bit of control in a life that no longer felt like it belonged to her. She could leave it locked. Clayton wouldn't question it. He had given her that choice. But for reasons she couldn't explain, not even to herself, she turned the latch. The click seemed too loud in the quiet hallway. Her pulse raced as she opened the door and stepped out into the cool air of early morning. The house looked different in the pale light, less intimidating, less foreign. The floorboards felt warmer under her feet. The scent of wood smoke lingered from the fire Clayton banked the night before. She walked to the kitchen and hesitated at the doorway. Clayton stood at the stove, stirring something in a pan, his hair still damp from washing, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He glanced at her with calm acknowledgement, nothing startled, nothing assuming. "Morning," he said. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Morning." That was all, but it was enough to make her chest tighten, an unfamiliar ache, like hope and fear tangled together. She filled a cup with water, her hands trembling slightly, aware of every movement he made behind her. She didn't stay long. When she retreated back to her room, she left the door unlocked. The next day she did the same, and the next. Clayton never mentioned the change, never made her regret it. His silence wasn't cold. It was respectful, patient, as though he understood she was learning how to breathe again. In time, Eleanor realized she had begun listening less for danger and more for the small, steady sounds that meant the house was waking. The clatter of pans, the low whinny of horses outside, the soft hum of a man who carried his grief so quietly, she almost missed it. The days still felt lonely. The nights still felt long. But each morning she unlocked her door a little easier than before. A small, fragile act of trust. Yet in a world like theirs, it was the bravest thing she had ever done. The morning light crept slowly across the wooden floorboards, slipping through the curtains like a shy visitor. Eleanor stepped into the kitchen with cautious footsteps, her fingers still warm from touching the beaded bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve. She hadn't expected to find Clayton there, sitting at the table, coffee in hand, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up as she entered, the slightest tilt of his head acknowledging her presence. "Morning," he said, voice quiet. She murmured the same and hesitated for a heartbeat before taking the chair across from him. It was the first time they had ever sat face to face at that table, without one of them rising to leave or stepping aside to make space. The moment felt delicate, as though one wrong move could shatter it. Clayton poured her a cup of coffee without asking. He slid it toward her. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her skin. They drank in silence, the bitter scent of the brew mingling with the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. It was the only sound in the room, marking each second as if reminding them that time was an uninvited witness to their uneasy marriage. For several long minutes, neither spoke. Then Eleanor lifted her eyes. "Why?" she said softly. "Did you agree to marry me?" Her voice was steady, but her heart wasn't. It beat hard against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't know what answer she expected. Maybe none at all. Maybe excuses. Maybe something she wasn't ready to hear. Clayton's gaze dropped to his coffee. He breathed out slowly through his nose before responding. "I thought it was practical." He spoke carefully, choosing each word like a stone he didn't want to drop. "Your father said the match would help both sides. His debt's cleared. I'd have someone to help keep the house, maybe tend the garden. A partnership more than a romance. That's what he told me." He paused, jaw tightening. "I didn't know he forced you." Eleanor swallowed the knot rising in her throat. The truth pressed against her chest, urging her to let it out. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she let herself speak fully. "The drought ruined everything," she said. "The fields turned to dust. Our goats starved. My father, he tried to fix things, tried harder than anyone should have to. But one day he came home with nothing left except the papers he'd signed." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "I saw him cry for the first time in my life." Clayton's brows drew together, not in anger, but in something quieter, heavier. Regret, maybe. "He told me," Eleanor continued, "that this marriage was the only way to keep our land. He said it was the best he could do for me. And I wanted to believe him." The room seemed to shrink around them, trapping her words in the air. Clayton didn't move for several seconds. He stared down at his hands, fingers curling into loose fists as though trying to hold something fragile. When he finally looked up, there was a rawness in his eyes she had never seen before. "If I had known he made you do it," Clayton said quietly, "I would have stopped the wedding, right there, in front of the whole town." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The conviction in it was enough to still her breath. "I never wanted a wife who didn't choose her place here." Eleanor's lips parted, surprise flickering across her face. She had expected indifference, maybe even defensiveness. Not this, not honesty laced with regret. Clayton leaned back slightly, as though giving her room to breathe. "I'm not a perfect man," he said, "but I'm not cruel. I wouldn't have taken you, your life, without your say." Silence filled the kitchen again, but this time it felt different. Not suffocating, not heavy, just still. Eleanor looked down at her coffee, watching the ripples fade. Something inside her loosened, softening like soil after rain. She wasn't ready to trust him fully, not yet, but a part of her acknowledged the sincerity in his voice. And it mattered, more than she expected. Without saying another word, she nodded. A small gesture, barely noticeable, but real. Clayton returned the nod once, matching her quiet acceptance. The clock continued ticking. The morning sun warmed the edges of the room. For the first time, their silence wasn't a wall, but a bridge. The days that followed carried a gentler rhythm, like the land itself had decided to breathe a little softer. Morning light spilled across the Hartwell Ranch in wide golden strokes, warming the fields, the fences, and gradually, though she hardly admitted it, the spaces inside Eleanor's chest that had long felt frozen. She woke earlier now, often before Clayton did. Stepping outside into the crisp dawn air, She found small pieces of peace in the work her mother had taught her back in the Apache village of her childhood. She prepared soil along the side of the house where the wind was softer and the sun lingered a bit longer. In those small, quiet moments, she planted tulips and daffodils, flowers not native to her people, but meaningful all the same. To Eleanor, planting anything was a way of calling for a new season, a sign that life could begin again. Some mornings Clayton would pass by on his way to the barn, tipping his hat in a silent greeting. He didn't hover or intrude. He simply took note of the flowers forming careful rows and offered a soft, almost shy, "Looks good there." Just a few words, but they warmed her like sunlight breaking through clouds. In the afternoons, he began teaching her how to ride. The first lesson was awkward, not because she feared the horse, but because she feared the closeness to Clayton. He stood beside her, steadying the reins, positioning her hands with slow, deliberate movements. He never touched her longer than necessary, never crowded her space. Each time he leaned in, he spoke gently, his voice low enough that she had to listen carefully. "Keep your shoulders relaxed. The horse can feel your tension." She nodded, focusing on the rhythm of breathing, on the leather reins, on the soft huff of Clementine, Clayton's gentlest mare, chosen specifically for Eleanor. By the third lesson, something unexpected happened. Clementine nudged Eleanor's shoulder, pressing her warm muzzle against her neck as though greeting a long-lost friend. Eleanor froze, surprised by the gesture. Horses didn't show affection to strangers, not easily, not without reason. She turned to look at Clayton. For the first time since the wedding, he smiled. Not a forced smile, not a polite one. A real smile. Quiet, warm, almost boyish. It startled her more than the horse's affection. She hadn't known he could smile like that. Clayton reached out to stroke Clementine's mane. "She likes you," he said simply. "Animals know good souls." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to accept the compliment. Instead, she focused on the horse, letting her fingers brush the smooth coat, letting herself feel something gentle for the first time in weeks. Days passed like that, soft, steady, uncomplicated. Work in the morning, riding lessons in the afternoon, simple dinners placed near her door in the evening. Sometimes she found Clayton sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon with a look she couldn't decipher. He always nodded to her as she walked by, a quiet recognition that felt strangely comforting. But outside the ranch, Copper Ridge was louder than ever. Whispers slithered through the saloon, the church, the general store. People spoke of the Apache bride, the marriage made from debt, the strange girl up at Hartwell Ranch. Words traveled fast in a small town, especially when they were sharp. Eleanor could feel the weight of those rumors each time she went to the market or passed by the post office. Eyes followed her, lips moved behind gloved hands, and even those who meant no harm stared too long. Yet something had shifted within her, because when she returned to the ranch, the wind always felt calmer. Clementine always trotted toward her. And Clayton, silent, steady Clayton, had begun looking at her not with confusion or distance, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as though he saw her not as a burden or an obligation, but as someone he could learn to understand. Trust didn't bloom overnight, but it took root, small, trembling, determined. And in the middle of that vast, rugged land where storms could rise in minutes, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not safety, not love, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to belong. It was late morning when Clayton hitched up the wagon and asked Eleanor to ride with him into Copper Ridge. He didn't phrase it as a command, just a simple invitation, but Eleanor sensed this was something she needed to do. She nodded and climbed aboard, her hands folding naturally around the worn edge of her shawl as the horses started down the familiar dirt road. The landscape rolled out before them in long stretches of dusty plains and sagebrush. A hawk circled overhead. The wind carried the dry scent of mesquite and faraway rain. Everything looked the same as the day she was forced to marry Clayton, but Eleanor felt different now. Not stronger, not safer, just more awake. The flowers she planted had started to sprout. Clementine trusted her. Clayton, in his quiet way, respected her. But Copper Ridge was another world entirely. As soon as the wagon wheels touched the packed earth of the main street, all warmth faded. People turned their heads, conversations paused. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, whispering questions. Men in dusty hats narrowed their eyes. Women in crisp dresses straightened their posture like birds puffing up their feathers to show disapproval. Eleanor kept her gaze down, but she felt every stare, sharp, cold, cutting. Clayton walked beside her as they headed toward the general store. He didn't touch her, didn't guide her arm, but his presence shielded her like a tall cedar tree blocking the wind. Inside the store, the atmosphere thickened. A group of well-dressed women near the counter went silent the moment Eleanor stepped in. Their eyes tracked her movements with the same disdain one would give to a stray dog wandering into a parlor. One of them, a tall woman with tightly pinned hair, whispered loudly enough for the entire store to hear. "Well, look at that! Hartwell really did marry her." Another replied, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "I guess some men don't care where their brides come from." A ripple of quiet laughter followed. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. Her fingers tightened around the canned goods she held. She wanted to disappear into the floorboards, let the earth swallow her whole. But she stood still, spine stiff, eyes fixed on the wooden shelf in front of her. She had known cruelty before. She had heard whispers in other towns, seen the suspicion people had for those who carried Apache blood. But being mocked as a wife, as an outsider in her own husband's world, struck deeper than she expected. She placed the cans in the basket and walked toward Clayton, who had been observing the women with a controlled, unreadable expression. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't scold them. But the way his jaw tightened said enough. They paid quickly and stepped outside. That was when the real storm hit. A drunk cowboy stumbled out of the saloon, boots dragging, shirt half untucked. His eyes landed on Eleanor, and something ugly lit up behind them. "Well, ain't this a sight?" he slurred. "Hartwell's Apache bride." He swaggered closer, breath thick with whiskey. "Tell me, sweetheart, did he pay in cash or in cattle?" Eleanor froze. The man reached out a hand toward her braid, but he never touched her. Clayton stepped between them so fast the cowboy lurched backward. He didn't shout. He didn't shove. He simply stood there, a wall of stone, shoulders wide, gaze colder than a river in winter. "Go home," Clayton said quietly. The cowboy blinked, unsteady. Something in Clayton's stare, its severity, its absolute certainty, made him retreat. He muttered something under his breath and staggered away toward the alley. Eleanor's pulse slowly began to settle, but the humiliation clung to her like fine dust trapped in clothing fibers. She felt it in her hair, her skin, her lungs. No matter how deeply she breathed, she couldn't shake it loose. The ride home was silent. Clayton drove the wagon with steady hands, but he didn't look at her, not out of avoidance, but out of respect. He knew she needed space. Back at the ranch, Eleanor stepped down before the wagon had even stopped fully. She walked past the porch, past the flower bed she had tended so carefully, and out toward the open stretch of land behind the house. The sky above her was enormous, an endless expanse of blue scraped with pale streaks of clouds. She tilted her head back, staring up at the first stars beginning to pierce the twilight. Their light was cold, distant, unbending. Much like the world she'd just faced, for the first time since arriving at the Hartwell Ranch, she wondered if she truly had any place in this land of fences and judgments. "Do I even deserve to be here?" she whispered to the night. The prairie wind swept past her, carrying no answer, only the lonely chorus of distant coyotes rising beneath the darkening sky. The invitation had arrived on a folded slip of paper left on the porch, written in neat cursive with too much perfume clinging to the ink. "The Copper Ridge Ladies' Circle cordially invites Mrs. Hartwell." Clayton didn't pressure her to go. He simply handed her the note and said, "It's your choice." But Eleanor knew she couldn't avoid the town's women forever, not if she wanted to reclaim even a sliver of dignity in a place determined to strip it from her. She wore her simplest dress and braided her hair tightly, the way her mother taught her whenever strength was needed. Then she walked into Copper Ridge alone, the dust swirling around her boots like a quiet warning. The ladies' circle met in the back room of the church, a place that smelled of lemon polish, stale cookies, and something sharper beneath the surface. As Eleanor stepped inside, a dozen heads turned in unison. Smiles bloomed instantly, wide and sweet and false. "Oh, Eleanor, we're so glad you came," one woman chirped, her voice dripping with honey that didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor nodded politely. "Thank you for inviting me." She took a seat near the back. The room buzzed with chatter about quilting projects, charity drives, and upcoming socials. But beneath every sentence, she sensed a current of curiosity, a hunger to examine her, prod her, measure her against the town's expectations. The sweetness in the air felt suffocating. Finally, when the refreshments were served and the surface-level chatter died down, the first knife was drawn. A woman with curled blonde hair leaned forward, crossing her arms with feigned casualness. "So," she said, her voice bright but sharpened at the edges, "tell us, what does it feel like to be bought?" The room went still. Every teacup froze halfway to a pair of lips. Every woman watched for the reaction, hungry for drama. Eleanor felt heat bloom in her chest, not embarrassment, but something deeper, something older, the kindling of anger. Before she could speak, another woman chimed in, her tone colder. "I imagine your father was grateful," she said. "A man with so many debts? I'm sure he got a fair price for you." A few women gasped softly, pretending to be shocked by the cruelty they themselves encouraged. But most simply waited, eyes sharp, wanting to see the Apache girl break. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't move. She breathed once, then again. She thought of her father kneeling in the dust, tears carving lines in his dirt-covered face. She thought of the hunger that gnawed at them through the drought. She thought of how he had whispered apologies while handing her the wedding dress, unable to look her in the eye. The hurt swelled, but it didn't drown her. It forged her. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, like the cutting edge of a flint blade. "My father wasn't greedy," she said. "He was desperate." She met each pair of eyes around the room unflinching. "And desperation doesn't make a man cruel. But what you're doing right now," her voice tightened, but it did not shake, "that is cruelty, pure and simple." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Someone dropped a spoon, someone else cleared her throat. Eleanor didn't wait for replies. She didn't need them. She turned, her braids swinging behind her like a warrior's banner, and walked toward the door. Her steps were heavy, weighted with everything she'd held in for weeks. But her chin was lifted, her spine straight. She refused to let them see weakness, not for 1 second. Outside, the crisp afternoon air hit her face like a splash of cold water. She breathed deeper than she had all day, filling her lungs until the tightness eased. As she walked down the wooden steps, she felt the ache in her chest settle into something solid, something she could build on. She was tired of shrinking, tired of hiding, tired of letting fear draw the boundaries of her world. By the time she reached the end of the street, her resolve had settled like iron in her bones. No more letting others decide her worth. No more letting shame dictate her steps. From this day forward, she would choose for herself, even if the world around her refused to choose her back. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the town. Eleanor walked right through them, head high, eyes forward, knowing she had crossed a line that she would never uncross again. For the first time since the wedding, she felt like she was becoming her mother's daughter again, and that was enough to keep her moving. The night after the women's gathering felt colder than any Eleanor had known since arriving at the Hartwell Ranch. Not the kind of cold that came from wind or weather, but the kind that seeped into bones, quiet, merciless, unshakable. She lay awake long after the house went still, staring at the low flame of the oil lamp until her eyes burned. No matter how she tried to push the memory away, the words of the Copper Ridge women returned to her in jagged flashes. Bought, price, not one of us. Each insult cut deeper than the last. By the time the lamp burned low, Eleanor couldn't stop trembling. The humiliation clung to her skin like a stain she feared would never wash out. And beneath it all was another fear, one far more dangerous. The fear that staying here meant slowly disappearing inside herself. So she made her decision. Before dawn, she slipped from her bed and sat at the small wooden desk by the window. The ink bottle shook in her hands as she opened it. She took a breath that felt like breaking glass and began writing. Clayton, you have been kinder than any man had reason to be. But I don't belong in this place. Not with the way people look at me. Not with the way I feel like a storm that never ends. I will not be a burden to you. Forgive me. Eleanor. Her handwriting wavered, but she didn't rewrite it. She folded the letter, placed it on the kitchen table, and gathered her few belongings into a small cloth bag. The sky outside was still dark. A single star gleamed through the window bars. She wondered if her mother's spirit watched from somewhere beyond the horizon. When the first gray light crept across the floorboards, Eleanor stepped outside onto the porch. The air tasted of dew and distant sagebrush. Her breath curled in little clouds as she stood there with her bag at her feet. She didn't expect Clayton to be awake, but when she turned, she found him standing in the doorway, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, hair messy from sleep. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised, just tired and quietly hurt. His eyes fell to the travel bag, then to her face. "You're leaving," he said softly. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came out, only a trembling breath. Clayton stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. Yet he didn't move closer. He kept a respectful distance, his posture steady but gentle, like a man trying not to frighten a wild horse. He nodded once, as if accepting something he didn't want to accept. "You should know something before you go," he said. His voice was calm, low, almost tender. "You're free. You've always been free, even if you don't believe it." The words hit her like a sudden summer rain, unexpected, cleansing, overwhelming. He wasn't trying to keep her. He wasn't trying to control her. He was letting her choose. For the first time since the wedding, the truth lodged itself deep in her heart. She wasn't a prisoner here. She wasn't an object to be pitied or traded. Clayton had given her space, respect, and a quiet kind of protection she'd never known. Her throat tightened painfully. She swallowed hard. "I thought leaving would make things easier for you. I didn't want to be the reason people talk. I didn't want you to feel ashamed." Clayton shook his head slowly. "People talk no matter what you do, and no one will make me feel ashamed of you." Eleanor's eyes burned, filling faster than she could blink them away. "But I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm enough for this place, or for you." Clayton stepped closer now, close enough for her to feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air. His expression held a quiet ache, the kind that came from years of loss. But behind it, there was something softer, something she had never noticed before. "Then let me ask you plain," he said gently. "Today, not yesterday, not because of debt or drought. Just today." His voice deepened, steady as a heartbeat. "Do you choose to be here? Do you choose me?" Eleanor felt her breath catch in her chest. The wind rustled the porch railing. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She looked down at the bag by her feet. Everything she had left of her old life bundled into one small bundle. Then she let her fingers slip from it. The bag hit the wooden floor with a soft thud. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I choose," she said, then more certain. "I choose you." Clayton exhaled shakily, as though releasing a weight he had carried for far too long. And for the first time, as the pale dawn spread across the land, Eleanor felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The land north of the ranch was quieter than the rest of Hartwell territory, a place of tall grasses waving like soft flames, sagebrush rolling in blue-green waves, and a single lone cottonwood tree standing guard by the dry creek bed. Clayton rarely brought anyone up here. Eleanor had seen him ride that way alone, always returning with the same steady silence in his step. But this morning, he asked her to come with him. They rode slowly, side by side, their horses leaving gentle prints on the dusted trail. The sun was still low, turning the plains gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of mesquite and morning dew. For a long time, neither spoke. Eleanor didn't mind. Silence with Clayton never felt heavy. It felt like the way the land itself breathed. Finally, they reached the ridge. Clayton dismounted first, tying his reins loosely to a gnarly juniper. Eleanor followed, brushing a hand over Clementine's warm neck before joining him. Clayton stood with his hands on his belt buckle, staring out over the wide stretch of untouched prairie. His jaw worked once, twice, like a man searching for the right place to set down a memory he'd carried too long. "You should know something about me," he said quietly. Eleanor's breath stilled. Clayton rarely volunteered anything about his past. He held himself the way old ranchers held fences, weathered, sturdy, built to keep the worst storms out. He lifted his hat slightly, rubbing a hand through his hair before continuing. "This land, this part here, it belonged to my wife." The word wife didn't sting Eleanor. It didn't surprise her either. She had felt the presence of someone lost in the corners of the house, in the careful way Clayton moved, in the way he avoided certain rooms. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked gently. "Lydia?" Clayton's voice softened around the syllables, almost reverent. "She was sick for years. Doctors in Cheyenne tried, but..." He exhaled slowly. "We lost her before winter." He let the wind fill the silence for a moment. "And the child?" Eleanor asked, because she sensed the weight he had not yet spoken. Clayton's eyes stayed on the horizon, but his voice dropped lower. "We were expecting a daughter." A pause. "She didn't make it either." Pain flickered over his face, not sharp, but old, like a scar that had learned to quiet itself, yet never truly healed. Eleanor's heart pulled tight. The land around them suddenly felt sacred, as if his grief had shaped it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Clayton nodded once. "I know." Then he turned to her fully, the first time since they arrived. "There's a reason I brought you here." Eleanor waited, unsure whether to brace herself or to let her heart open. "My wife loved this land," he said. "Said it reminded her of beginnings more than endings. Before she passed, she asked me to make sure whoever walked it next understood that." Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry despite the cool air. "Why tell me this now?" Clayton hesitated, just for a breath. But when he met her eyes again, there was no wall left standing. "Because I want you to be the next person who walks it," he said softly. "And the one after that. And the one after that." She stared at him, stunned. "This is your memory of her," Eleanor said, voice trembling. "Your grief, your roots. Why give it to me?" "Because you treat the land like it's alive," he answered. "Like it's kin. The way she did. The way your people do." Her heart thudded painfully. No one outside her tribe had ever spoken of her heritage with such respect. Never mind a wealthy rancher who could have easily dismissed her as nothing more than a marriage of circumstance. He stepped closer, but not too close. He always left space for her to decide. "There's something I'm preparing," he said, the hint of a smile touching the edges of his words. "Something big, but I can't tell you yet, not until it's ready." "What is it?" Eleanor asked, half whisper, half prayer. Clayton shook his head gently. "You'll know soon." Then he added, more tender than she had ever heard him speak. "For now, I just need you to trust me." The wind stilled. The world seemed to lean in. Eleanor felt the old fear rise up, the fear of being given something only to lose it, the fear of believing in someone only to be left behind. But beside that fear was something new, something steadier, something warm. She drew in a slow breath, letting the land hold her steady. For the first time since leaving her village, she didn't feel like she was standing on borrowed earth. She met Clayton's gaze, her voice steady and sure. "I trust you." Clayton closed his eyes briefly, as if those 3 words had lifted a burden he hadn't realized he still carried. And with that, the space between them, wide as the prairie itself, finally began to mend. The church in Copper Ridge had never held so many people. The pews creaked under the weight of ranchers in their Sunday hats, merchants in stiff collars, wives holding hymnals like shields. The stained glass windows painted the room in reds and golds, but even the morning sun couldn't soften the tension humming beneath the roof. Eleanor sat near the front, her back straight, her braid wrapped in red and turquoise thread, the way her mother had once taught her. She felt the eyes on her, some curious, some resentful, some ashamed, but her heartbeat was calm. Today she belonged to herself. Clayton stood a few seats away, hands clasped, shoulders squared as if bracing for a storm only he could see coming. When the pastor finished the final prayer, Clayton rose. The room shifted. Conversations died mid-whisper. Boots scuffed to a halt. Even the children sensed something unusual and froze. Clayton turned to face the congregation. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of truth and command, unyielding, like the man himself. "I've got something to say." Kaki. The pastor stepped aside. Every head swiveled toward the tall rancher, and beside him, Eleanor lifted her chin, not out of pride, but out of quiet readiness. Clayton reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope sealed with the Hartwell family stamp. He opened it slowly, deliberately, as though revealing more than paper, revealing intention. "This," he said, holding it up for all to see, "is the deed for 200 acres of Hartwell land, north pasture near the spring." A wave of gasps rippled through the church. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew what that land meant. It wasn't just fertile, it was sacred ground, the richest water, the strongest soil, the heart of the ranch. Clayton's gaze moved across the room, steady as a drawn line. "And as of this morning, that land belongs fully and legally to Eleanor Wade Hartwell." Silence fell so deep the air itself seemed to stop. Eleanor froze, breath caught halfway in her chest. She hadn't known, not even after the day he took her to the ridge, not even after she told him she trusted him. Whispers erupted. "She's Apache. He gave her the north pasture? Is he out of his mind? What will the family say?" Clayton didn't flinch. "I'm not done," he said, and the murmurs died instantly. He looked toward Eleanor then, softly but with a fire she had never seen in him before. "She is not something I purchased. She is not a debt paid. She is not a burden placed in my home." He paused, letting every word settle like thunder rolling across the plains. "She is a woman I respect, a woman with the strength of her people, and she is my partner, by choice, not by force." Even the old bell above the church seemed to hold its breath. To the side, the very women who had mocked her at the sewing circle stared at the floorboards. The cowboys who had laughed behind her back swallowed hard. The sheriff, who once said she'd never fit in Copper Ridge, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Clayton turned to Eleanor, offering his hand. He didn't pull. He didn't demand. He simply waited. Eleanor stood slowly, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The colors of her braid glowed under the stained glass light, like embers of an ancestral fire. She stepped up beside him. From this distance, she could see the faint tremor in his fingers. Not fear, but hope. A man who had lost so much, trusting her with something he had never shared with another soul. Eleanor took his hand, not because she owed him, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time since standing in a borrowed wedding dress, she chose. The two of them faced the congregation together, hand in hand. And in that moment, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. The judgment in the room loosened. The old prejudice cracked. A few heads nodded slowly. One woman wiped her eyes. A rancher in the back removed his hat in respect. Eleanor felt the weight of generations in her chest, of her mother, her ancestors, the land itself, and for the first time since leaving her village, she felt whole. When they left the church, the entire town watched them walk out side by side. Not a bought bride and her wealthy husband, but partners, chosen, a future built not from desperation, but from dignity. And as the door closed behind them, Copper Ridge remained silent, because sometimes respect is loudest when people have no words left to fight it.